Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to iWizard. Today we're going to be talking about one of the greatest horror stories of all time, the one, the only, H.P Lovecraft's Call of Cthulhu. Let's get into it. Alright, Jordan here. So let's get into H.P. Lovecraft's short story, The Call of Cthulhu. This story was written in the summer of 1926, but was first published in Weird Tales Pulp magazine in 1928. Lovecraft claims that the first seeds of this story came to him actually in a dream. In the dream, Lovecraft is visiting a rare antiquities museum in an attempt to convince the aged curator there to buy a strange bas-relief sculpture that he had just made. The curator scoffs at Lovecraft, apparently, for trying to sell something that he had just made to a museum of rare antiquities. And so Lovecraft in the dream remembers himself answering, "Why do you say that this thing is new? The dreams of men are older than brooding Egypt, or the contemplative Sphinx, or garden-girdled Babylon, and this was fashioned in my dreams." So that is a very Lovecraftian answer there, and whether or not this story is apocryphal is anyone's guess, but it's definitely a cool story. Apparently the story was also inspired by Guy de Maupassant's La Horla. That's a story my wife and I just read out loud together. And by the way, the book that I'm holding right here is the Necronomicon, named after Lovecraft's fictional grimoire, his Book of the Dead. And this is the best weird tales of H.P. Lovecraft. These are all the master's best stories, and so I would definitely say that this is the collection that you want to get. Pick it up if you can. All right, so let's get into what the story is about. The Call of Cthulhu is told by Francis Wayland Thurston, whose elderly uncle, George Angle, professor of Semitic languages at Brown University, has just passed away in a very strange and suspicious manner. As the heir and executor of his uncle's estate, Thurston has to sift through the professor's papers and things, because some of it's going to be donated to the American Archaeological Society. Among his notes, Thurston finds a small bas-relief sculpture which resembles simultaneously an octopus, a human, and a dragon. A pulpy, tentacled head surmounting a grotesque and scaly body with rudimentary wings. The sculpture, it turns out, was made by Wilcox, a young artist from the Rhode Island School of Design, who based his creation on a delirious dream of, quote, great cyclopean cities of titanic blocks and sky-flung monoliths dripping with ooze and horror. In letters to his uncle, the young artist mentions something called Cthulhu and a city called Relia. As Thurston goes through his uncle's papers, he learns that the professor had also discovered reports of mania, outbreaks of mental illness and group folly, hysterical mob behavior, and all of it is related to this Relia and Cthulhu nonsense. And he's learning that basically all over the world, in remote, disparate places, there is increasing evidence that there is a secret cult devoted to Cthulhu, this weird creature. Here's how the whole thing is described in the story. They worshipped, so they said, the great old ones who lived ages before there were any men and who came to the young world out of the sky. These old ones were gone now, inside the earth and under the sea, but their dead bodies had told their secrets in dreams to the first man who formed a cult which had never died. This was that cult, and the prisoners said it had always existed and would always exist, hidden in distant wastes and dark places all over the world until the time when the great priest Cthulhu from his dark house in the mighty city of Relia under the waters should rise and bring the earth again under his sway. Someday he would call, when the stars were ready, and the secret cult would always be waiting to liberate him. In New York City, hysterical Levantines mob police. In California, a theosophist colony dress in white robes awaiting a glorious fulfillment. There are reports that wild cult-like orgies are increasing in places that practice voodoo, like Haiti. Reports of devil-worshipping cults of Eskimos in Greenland, in the swamps outside of New Orleans, in China and New Zealand, in Australia and Norway and Arabia. All of this secret activity around the world has to do with this ancient cult, a quote, form of devil worship which had come down from horribly ancient aeons before the world was made. New evidence, strange and mysterious, keeps emerging. The American Archaeological Society gets its hands on a mysterious greenish-black carved stone idol depicting this creature Cthulhu. We meet more and more people who have encountered strange things. The artist, a seaman from Norway, an aged mestizo, people with forbidden knowledge. As police begin to investigate and raid this cult activity, new evidence comes to light of these groups who worship, quote, the great old ones who lived ages before there were any men and formed a cult which had never died, hidden in the distant wastes and dark places all over the world until the time when the great priest Cthulhu from his dark house in the mighty city of Relia under the waters should rise and bring the earth again under his sway. And that when the stars aligned in exactly the right way, Cthulhu would come again. And so that is the basic gist of the story. I don't want to give any more away because then we're basically getting into spoiler territory, but that's kind of the setup. And let's just say that the story builds and builds and builds until the heart-pounding ending where you actually get to see what this thing is, where it resides, and what it can actually do to men, this giant, lumbering, ancient creature. So that is the Call of Cthulhu. Let's get into some of the things that I liked and some of the things that I didn't like. So things that I liked, boy, is there a lot to say here. But first, I want to zoom back and tell you the brief story of how I came to know about Cthulhu and Lovecraft. So some years ago, I lived very far away from my job, and so I bought a Prius because of the gas mileage so that it wouldn't be expensive to make the commute. So one day, this was after I'd been driving the car for several years, I was in a store and I saw this decal, and it was a play on the Jesus fish thing, but it was this monster, Cthulhu, right? So it's designed to look like that Jesus fish car decal, but instead it's this monstrous squid-like Cthulhu thing. And this was during that era when all the atheists were getting spaghetti monster decals to make fun of religious people. And so I said, okay, this is actually kind of fun. It's not making a statement. It's not really making fun of religious people, but it's like cheeky and literary and funny. Now, at the time, I knew a little bit of what Cthulhu was, but I hadn't read the story. So before I bought the decal, I looked up everything I could about it, and I said, wow, when I have time, I'm going to have to read this story. And so eventually I did. I remember I picked the story up and started reading it in my classroom after school one day, and I was reading it, and then some of my colleagues, I think, came into my room and wanted to go out for drinks, and so I had gotten like a quarter of the way through Call of Cthulhu, but never finished it. So this week, I finally finished Call of Cthulhu, and boy, am I glad I did. So let's get back to what I liked. First of all, I love the fact that this story uses a frame narrative. Call of Cthulhu is a found manuscript story. You learn that you're reading the manuscript of Thurston, who finds the manuscript of his uncle, Professor Engel, who himself dives into other people's manuscripts while he's writing his. So there's definitely this meta-epistolary quality to the narrative that makes the story feel, I would say, real and kind of believable and historical. And then there are times when the narrator even puts the manuscript down to go research stuff on his own that he finds in his uncle's manuscripts. He goes to investigate them. Then the story actually ends by having the main character Thurston stow away the manuscript that he's just written, hoping that no one finds it. It's just done so seamlessly and expertly that you barely even notice it, or at least it's not distracting. It works well. Another thing I liked, and this is definitely something the author is known for, is the feeling of otherworldly horror that Lovecraft evokes. Part of this is the tradition that Lovecraft is writing within. By 1928, when this story was published, the last frontiers of Earth had already been mapped. We had explored most of the world. We'd gone down into the oceans. We'd explored the polar regions, encountered formerly long-lost tribes. We had learned what really lay at the center of the Earth, even though there was still some debate about that. So in many ways, The sci-fi, fantasy, and horror genres, the speculative fiction of Lovecraft's age, grew out of a sense of loss. People were yearning for new vistas, given that there were really none remaining. And that's what Lovecraft in particular is a master at doing. Lovecraft creates these new frontiers of the imagination. Lovecraft is all about raising whole new worlds from the dead, exploring nether realms, giving readers brief glimpses of what kind of lurks in the dark. In Call of Cthulhu, you learn about lost cities, creatures from other dimensions, secret cults that have escaped the taint of modernity, obscene horrors that can be raised by the dark arts, truths long forgotten, monsters and myths, or, as the epigraph from Algernon Blackwood puts it at the beginning of the story, shapes and forms long since withdrawn before the tide of advancing humanity, forms of which poetry and legend alone have caught a flying memory. And so Lovecraft is just an expert at making you feel like there's this whole other world out there that you have overlooked, that you don't have access to because it hasn't been kind of unlocked for you yet, right? You haven't been in the right place at the right time with the right people. In Call of Cthulhu, for example, you have mysterious unknown islands raised by earthquakes. You have this corpse city of terror called Relia with its buildings and pillars and monoliths of green oozing stone. It's this city of strange angles and horrid, abnormal, non-Euclidean geometries, objects and unearthed stones and statues and slabs covered in hieroglyphs, and you have odd languages in this story and chants. The language is the one language that the people who are in this cult speak kind of reminds you of the Black speech from Lord of the Rings, and you're like, what does all this mean? And Lovecraft does such a great job at not showing too much, at just giving you enough to make you want more. You kind of just get a little bit of the mystery, and you just want to explore it all and uncover the secrets that lay within the safe or tomb or city or whatever it is that he happens to be writing about. For example, when you finally do get to see the great sunken cyclopean dream city, which by the way is kind of like Atlantis, if you explored Atlantis like on an acid trip, when you finally do get to see this city, you only get to see a small part of it. Literally, and I'm not making a double entendre here, just the tip. You get to see just the tip of this city. You'll trust me, you'll know what I mean when you read the story of just the tip. But I realized that the way that Lovecraft creates this wonder, this awe, this horror, is so much about the way that he uses language and his expansive vocabulary. The prose is dense and labyrinthine, and it's overloaded with these archaic and Byzantine words that you're not 100% sure what all of them mean, but they have this phono-aesthetic quality. Let me give you a sample of what I mean on page 211 of the Necronomicon right here in Call of Cthulhu. So here we go. So a body of 20 police filling 2 carriages and an automobile had set out in the late afternoon with the shivering squatter as a guide. At the end of the passable road they alighted, and for miles splashed on in silence through the terrible cypress woods where day never came. Ugly roots and malignant hanging nooses of Spanish moss beset them, and now and then a pile of dank stones or fragments of a rotting wall intensified by its hint of morbid habitation, a depression which every malformed tree and every fungus islet combined to create. At length the squatter settlement, a miserable huddle of huts, hove in sight, and hysterical dwellers ran out to cluster around the group of bobbing lanterns. The muffled beat of tom-toms was now faintly audible far, far ahead, and a curdling shriek came at infrequent intervals when the wind shifted. A reddish glare, too, seemed to filter through the pale undergrowth beyond endless avenues of forest night. Reluctant even to be let alone again, each of the cowed squatters refused point-blank to advance another inch toward the scene of unholy worship. So, Inspector Legrasse and his 19 colleagues plunged on, unguided, into black arcades of horror that none of them had ever trod before. The The region now entered by the police was one of traditionally evil repute, substantially unknown and untraversed by white men. There were legends of a hidden lake unglimpsed by mortal sight, in which dwelt a huge, formless, white, polypus thing with luminous eyes, and squatters whispered that bat-winged devils flew up out of caverns in inner earth to worship it at midnight. They said it had been there before d'Iberville, before La Salle, before Indians, and before even the wholesome beasts and birds of the woods. It was nightmare itself, and to see it was to die. But it made men dream, and so they knew enough to keep away. The present voodoo orgy was, indeed, on the merest fringe of this abhorred area, but that location was bad enough. Hence, perhaps the very place of the worship had terrified the squatters more than the shocking sounds and incidents. So that is just a little taste of what Lovecraft can do. And again, this is the most mundane of samples. I didn't want to give anything too much away, but I want to say that so much of what Lovecraft does is to pick words that are familiar to your mind, but just unfamiliar enough so as to evoke a sense of wonder and to conjure senses and connotations and evocations that are highly suggestive. He relies on synesthesia, so the senses. In other words, he draws not only on the intellect, but he employs all of the senses too. When you encounter something, you know what it looks like, what it smells like, what it would feel like, what it sounds like, and all of that good stuff. So he is just masterful at lifting you into another reality and enveloping you in what they call semantic fields of horror and terror. And so that is the best of what Lovecraft can do. Another thing I want to say is that I love the fact that this story starts out with this guy sifting through his uncle's stuff, and then slowly but surely you get to uncover more and more about the truth of this cult, about the mystery bit by bit. And when everything is finally revealed, I can't express to you how satisfying it actually is. I love the ending of this story. And lastly, I just want to say one more thing, something that I kind of appreciated about this story that I haven't seen in quite some time. To me, at least, it was actually refreshing to read a story that externalizes the evil bad guy. In Call of Cthulhu, there is a big, bad, evil monster out there that threatens the balance of things. Now, if the 20th century was about anything, right? Think about the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, Cambodia, East Germany, Jim Crow, apartheid, genocide, the Holocaust. Just think about all of the evils that happened in the 20th century, the evils that man perpetrates against man. So if we could say that there is one thing that has animated what we call modernism, it has been that evil is not some external thing. Evil is actually inside of us. Corruption, greed, rapaciousness, lust for power, we know it's in every human heart. Just think of that Solzhenitsyn quote, "The line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties, but right through every human heart." Think of books like Lord of the Flies. The beast is in us. It's in us. Fancy thinking the beast was something that you could hunt and kill, the Lord of the Flies says to Simon in Simon's Little Glade. And I think that is completely true. All of that is true and good and well and very sagely and wise advice. But sometimes I just want a good story where humans are trying to be good and some evil monster just starts terrorizing them. And in this case, it's an evil that is baked into the fabric of the world. It's an evil from some other dimension, and every once in a while, that's all I want. Sometimes I need a break from the cynicism and the navel-gazing, and I just want to be told that human beings can be good, and we want to protect each other, and that evil is out there, and all we can really do is just try to protect each other and huddle for warmth. So let's talk about now what I didn't like. There isn't a heck of a lot that I didn't like. This story is fantastic. I guess if I had to say a couple of things, we could start with the character work. The character work isn't great, but I think some of that is just the format. This is a short story, and this particular short story is kind of told at a distance. It's about all these disparate phenomena that are occurring and kind of putting the puzzle pieces together. It's told via documents and manuscripts. So this book isn't really a character study. It's really not meant to be. So it's really not that much of a negative. It's kind of fine. But if you're looking for a deep dive into characters, you want to get on the inside of characters' heads, maybe this isn't for you. The writing style, although I love it and I think it's an absolutely essential part of Lovecraft's work, the writing style is going to turn a lot of people off. It does at times have a kind of pulpy quality to it. Sometimes the descriptions are overwrought and dramatic, where you get these adjective pile-ups and you get these sentences where Lovecraft uses 8 to 10 words that are just, everything is the cyclopean, Arborean, Polypian, phantasmagoric, dreamlike basilisk of his Protean dreamscape of Sisyphean doom terrors, right? And so, yeah, there are times where you're just like, okay, lay off the absinthe, H.P. Lovecraft. And again, it's actually one of the reasons when he does it well that I love his writing, but sometimes he loses control and it becomes a little much and he goes kind of over the top with his descriptions and his sort of dripping purple prose. What else can we say? The plot is nothing special, I guess. The story is kind of all in the details and the descriptions and this monstrous Cthulhu creature that he's created. So if you're looking for a Dan Brown novel that slowly unfolds and has all of these like clever twists and turns and plot mechanisms, that's really not what you're getting here. The premise here is pretty simple. You can read this story in about an hour if you stay focused and locked in. It's probably going to be hard to listen to on audiobook just because, again, the prose is so dense. But otherwise, those things were very small and kind of minute and nitpicky. I'm aware of that. I have very little negative to say about Call of Cthulhu, and Lovecraft is a master of the horror genre. All right, so that is it for today. And as always, thanks for tuning in. Please subscribe to this channel. Feel free to get in touch with me on Facebook, Goodreads. Feel free to tip your booktuber via Patreon. I'm on there. And that's it. Happy reading, and I'll see you next time.